Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Italian Campaign. This Week in the Italian Campaign, brought to you by the Freedom for Italy Network. Episode 66, The Allied Armies in Italy in February 1945. At the end of January 1945, the front line in Italy was largely unchanged from where it was when major operations in December ended. UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt, and the combined Chiefs of Staff met in Malta on the 30th of January to the 3rd of February as they travelled to the Big Three summit in Yalta with Stalin. They were joined by Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Mediterranean, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, and he was told that the 1st Canadian Corps would be transferred out of Italy to northwest Europe, together with 3 other divisions. This plan was subsequently revised, and only the 5th Division, which had spent 8 months in Palestine, was removed from the Italian front. It sailed to Naples, and from there moved immediately to Marseilles. This reduced Allied land forces in Italy to 17 divisions, including 3 armoured formations compared with 21 under-strength German ones. Allied forces in Italy were strengthened by the arrival of 4 Italian combat groups with British equipment and in British uniforms. They were the Cremona Combat Group, which was allocated to 5 corps, while Friuli Combat Group went to 10 corps. The Folgore Combat Group was attached to 13 Corps, which returned to the 8th Army, and the Legnano Combat Group was allocated to 2 Corps in the 5th Army. Other additions included an Italian Special Air Service Unit and the Jewish Brigade, comprising 3 battalions, which included recruits from the Palestine Mandate, as well as Jews from Poland, Russia, Hungary, Italy, France, Yemen, and the UK. The brigade was commanded by Ernest Benjamin, a British Army officer born in Canada who had been commissioned into the Royal Engineers in 1919. The 2nd New Zealand Division was reorganised with the creation of a 3rd purely-infantry brigade out of its cavalry, motor and machine gun battalions, and some reinforcements from New Zealand. On the 2nd of February, 2 Commando Brigade rejoined the 8th Army. It comprised 4 commando units and the Special Boat Service. They were to be followed in March by the 2nd Parachute Brigade, which had been deployed in Greece. In preparation for the spring offensive, 8th Army formations were reorganised. At the start of February, the 78th Division was pulled out of the Apennines, where it had been since October, and transferred to the front line along the Senio River valley between 2 Polish Corps and 8th Indian Division. The 56th Division was shifted to take over Canadian positions between Fusignano and Lake Commacchio. Holding the Allied line across the southern part of the Po River Valley, the 8th Army was to play a crucial role in the opening phases of the Allied attack in the spring. In the meantime, they carried out harassment and information gathering operations across the Senio River. In February, the 5th Army began operations to improve its positions on the 4-Corps front using formations of the African-American 92nd Division. The first was launched on the 4th of February in the Churchill Valley against high points to the west and to Monte della Stella on the east by a battalion apiece of 365 and 366 infantry. A resistance increased after modest advances. In the coastal region, attacks were launched at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of February. They involved 370 and 371 infantry on the right and Task Force 1 based on the 3rd Battalion of 366 infantry on the coast north of Forte dei Marmi. A resistance was strong. The stiffest was on the left, on the flat terrain, which was exposed to small arms fire, supporting mortars, and field artillery and coastal guns firing from La Spezia area to the north. Infantry in Task Force 1, riding on the tanks of 760 Tank Battalion, crossed the Cinquale Canal. After advancing 500 yards, it turned inland towards a coastal road which paralleled Highway 1 and encountered thick minefields. Heavy artillery, mortar and machine gun fire prevented engineers from bridging the canal and breaching the minefield ahead of the force. But despite the fire, the entire force managed to reach the north side of the canal by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were joined by a company of the 1st Battalion of 370 Infantry. On the 9th of February, 370 and 371 Infantry made limited gains, but 370 got light elements on the summit of Monte Stretoia. The Germans immediately stiffened defences on Highway 1. Task Force 1 continued to suffer heavily. Its bridgehead north of the canal extended about 1,000 yards along the beach and 500 yards inland, but tanks restricted by minefields were forced to remain on the beach. German counterattacks were beaten off. A heavier thrust at 5:30 in the evening pushed back the perimeter of the bridgehead. Remaining elements of the 1st Battalion of 370 Infantry were committed to help hold the ground and were ferried over the canal on tanks. The next day, while 370 Infantry held its positions, 371 struggled to maintain a foothold east of the Stretoia hill mass against further counterattacks. Task Force 1 attempted to break through to Highway 1. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, infantry in the bridgehead were pushed back. At 7:30, the entire force was ordered to pull back south of the canal. By the morning of the 10th, it had withdrawn to points a mile south of the canal. Its 70-hour stand north of the Cinquale Canal cost 760 Tank Battalion 16 medium tanks, and 758 lost 4 light tanks. The 3rd Battalion of 366 Infantry lost 329 men killed, wounded, or missing. On the 11th of February, offensive operations further inland also ceased. A counterattack against the 3rd Battalion of 370 Infantry recaptured most of the ground the regiment had taken. The 2nd Battalion stopped the German attack and, with 371 Infantry, consolidated on approximately the same ground as that occupied before the offensive was undertaken. In a reorganisation following the attack, artillery units and 84 Chemical Battalion were shifted to the eastern part of the 4 Corps sector. The 1st Battalion of 370 Infantry took over the extreme coastal sector. The 3rd Battalion of 366 Infantry withdrew to Viareggio for reorganisation. This set the scene for further limited operations in the second half of February on the 5th Army front around Highway 64 from Pistoia to Bologna. Army Commander Lucien Truscott believed this was a weaker point in Axis defensive lines south of the city than the route preferred by Supreme Commander in Italy, Mark Clark, for the spring offensive, which was to follow Highway 65. That story will be told in the next episode of This Week in the Italian Campaign. Well, that takes us up roughly to the middle of February 1945. As you can see, very limited operations. Further operations will be undertaken at the end of February, and this is setting the scene for the major Allied attack, which was planned for April 1945. That was eventually going to end the war in Italy. Elsewhere in the Second World War, the campaign was reaching a climax in northwest Europe with the entry into Germany. and the attacks in the Pacific to close in on the Japanese homeland were escalating. So this is a critical moment in the Second World War. Anyway, that's it for this week. We'll be back next week with another episode. So until then, from everybody here at the Italian campaign, this week in the Italian campaign, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.